Good morning and namaskaram to everyone. On behalf of Shruti, the India Music and Dance Society, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the next event of our spring season. Today we present a talk by Sriram Venkatakrishnan on the life and times of Sri Gopalakrishna Bharathi. Sri V. Sriram is a music historian, heritage activist, and a columnist. He pioneered the concept of heritage walks in Chennai in 1999, and it has since gained a lot of momentum. He contributes regularly to the Hindu and also serves as one of the 4 secretaries of the Madras Music Academy. Sri V. Sriram's blog, Madras Heritage and Carnatic Musings, is a go-to site for trivia on these 2 topics. He is a popular invited speaker, very well known for bringing out unknown facets of musicians and the music scene of yore. We are very happy to be able to present him today for the first time on Shruti's stage. Most appropriate to the theme, supporting today's presentation is Vidwan Bharat Sundar, a much sought after vocalist known for his adherence to tradition while balancing unbridled creativity. Sri Bharat Sundar has won several awards. To name just a couple, the Kalki S. Krishnamurti Award and the Best Concert Award in the senior category of Madras Music Academy in 2018 and 2019. We are excited that he's able to join the presentation today. At the end of the presentation, we will hop on to a different live stream link where we will meet with Sri V. Sriram for a Q&A session. So as you watch the talk and questions pop in your mind, please post these questions to Facebook or YouTube channel, wherever you may be. We will collect all these questions and try to cover as many as we can in the Q&A. Thank you all very much. Sit back and enjoy the presentation.
Greetings to all members of Shruti Music Dance Society of Philadelphia. Thank you very much for having invited me to speak today on the subject of Gopalakrishna Bharathi, his life and times. It gives me great happiness to welcome Vidwan Bharat Sundar today, who has gladly agreed to render some of the compositions of Gopalakrishna Bharathi and another composer as well, based upon the flow of the story. The topic itself is one of abiding interest as far as Carnatic music lovers go. When we talk of Nandan Charitram, we are always reminded of Gopalakrishna Bharathi. When we speak of Gopalakrishna Bharathi, we are reminded of Nandan Charitram. The 2 of them have coalesced to become one subject. But was Nandan Charitram all that was there to Gopalakrishna Bharathi's life? That is what we will be seeking to explore in the next 90 minutes or so of this presentation. Gopalakrishna Bharathi was coeval in time to Tyagaraja, Muthuswami Dikshitar and Shyama Shastri, but he was not a contemporary, he was a junior. But there must have been a portion of time when he lived at the same time as the Trinity. Certainly, he met Tyagaraja. Therefore, he forms a very vital link in the history of Carnatic music. And when we also consider that with the arrival of the Trinity, much of what was Tamil music or Tamil songs prior to their time vanished, we also realize how important Gopalakrishna Bharathi was, because in the aftermath of the Carnatic Trinity, his compositions really stood the test of time and came down to us, sadly though not with their music intact, but certainly with their lyrics intact. So Gopalakrishna Bharathi forms a very vital bridge between the Trinity and the latter day composers who then come towards the end of the 19th century. Bharathi himself was something of a miracle, because unlike the standard Carnatic music tradition of parents, who had divine vision about the birth of a child, about a great musical guru appearing at a very appropriate moment, recognizing the genius in the composer and so on, all the standard biographies that we are familiar with, Bharathi was markedly different. In fact, it was a wonder that Bharathi survived at all. We have no idea as to when Gopalakrishna Bharathi was born. There are several conflicting accounts. Uve Swaminathan, when he wrote in 1936, writes that Gopalakrishna Bharathi was born around 150 years prior to the time of writing, which places him squarely in the 18th century. But then when M.S. Ramaswamy Iyer wrote the first English biography of Gopalakrishna Bharathi in 1932 and interviewed Uve Swaminathan Iyer for it, he derived by means of some fairly complicated mathematics that Gopalakrishna Bharathi was born in 1811. And certainly the explanation that he gives, that Swaminathan Iyer was 17 when he met Gopalakrishna Bharathi for the first time in 1871 or thereabouts, and that Bharathi at that time was around 60 years of age, and then working backwards, he arrives at the year 1811. And so we have to take that as a fairly accurate assessment of when Gopalakrishna Bharathi was born. He was born in the village of Narimanam, which today is famous for the oil and natural gas commission's drilling that goes on in the search of natural gas along the Kaveri basin. Bharati's father, Ramaswamy Bharathi, was a Veena Vidwan, and the suffix to the name, the Bharathi, which is the suffix, was actually given to the family as an honorific for their learning. Bharathi was very young when he lost his mother, and certainly he appears to have lost his father by the time he was 5 or 6. There was a small amount of land that came to him as his inheritance, but an evil uncle, Anantaram Iyer, stepped in and cheated Bharathi of that possession and had him kicked out of the house. In effect, Bharathi became an orphan and wandered for a long period of time without home and without any means of sustenance. So it is really a wonder, as I said earlier, that in that harsh 19th century, when there was no protection for children of that kind, Bharathi not only survived, but he thrived and he learnt music in that process. Perhaps much of what he suffered never left him, which is why when he composed Nandan Charitram, he is able to depict suffering very, very well. And then there is that famous composition, Thandai Tha Irundal, where he attributes the feeling of being an orphan to the Lord himself. Let us hear Bharat sing a part of that song before we proceed further.
Thandai Tha Irundal உலகத்தில் உமக்கிந்த தாழ்வெல்லாம் வருமோ ஐயா தந்தை தாய் இருந்தால் உலகத்தில் உமக்கிந்த தாழ்வெல்லாம் வருமோ ஐயா பெற்ற தந்தை தாய் இருந்தால் உலகத்தில் உமக்கிந்த தாழ்வெல்லாம் வருமோ ஐயா பெற்ற தந்தை தாய் இருந்தால் உலகத்தில் உமக்கிந்த தாழ்வெல்லாம் வருமோ ஐயா அந்தமில் நடம் செய்யும் அம்பலவாணரே, அந்தமில் நடம் செய்யும் அம்பலவாணரே, அந்தமில் நடம் செய்யும் அம்பலவாணரே, அருமையாகவே பெற்று ஒருமையுடன் வளர்த்த, அருமையாகவே பெற்று ஒருமையுடன் வளர்த்த தந்தை தாயிருந்தால் உலகத்தில் உமக்கிந்த தாழ்வெல்லாம் வருமோ ஐயா?
So he asks the Lord, would you have suffered all these insults if you had had father and mother who would have protected you? Then he goes on to list the various attacks that Lord Shiva suffered on his person. So Shakya Nayanar hitting him with stones, Kannappa Nayanar placing his slippers on him, and then Arjuna coming and hitting him with the bow, the Madurai king Pandyan hitting him on the back, thrashing him on the back with a staff, and so on. And so he describes all of it and says, none of this would have befallen you had you had parents who would have taken care of you. And finally it says, Balakrishnan idai parkumpadi ache. So Balakrishnan being his own mudra, he says, we had to witness all this suffering. So in a way, he was trying to bring in, internalize what he had seen and then what he had suffered into his compositions. If that was what he brought into his songs, his appearance certainly showed all that he had suffered. Writing about him in 1870, Uve Swaminath Iyer, his principal biographer and the great Tamil scholar, says that Bharati was hunchbacked, he was completely bald, he was malformed in the sense that his legs were extremely thick and he walked with great difficulty holding a staff, and that his appearance was not prepossessing at all. Therefore, he did not have the ISO 9000 characteristics of what would make for a good Vidwan. And so many people actually dismissed Bharati when they first looked at him. In fact, Swaminath Iyer himself is very honest enough to write that he was shocked when he saw Gopalakrishna Bharathi and when he realized that this was that great composer himself. What Bharati did during that years when he was growing up, we have no idea. There are certain unfounded stories that he even worked in the kitchen at the Jnana Saraswati temple in Kutanur. But these are unsubstantiated stories, and perhaps it is a way of giving divine attribution to his skill as a composer. But somewhere along the line, Bharati appears to have picked up a considerable amount of composing ability in Tamil, though it would take time to flower and manifest itself. But at some point of time, he appears to have migrated to the temple town of Thiruvidai Marudur or Madhyarjunam, where the Lord is known as Mahalinga Swami, the goddess is Bharat Sundar Kuchamba, and there is a beautiful temple fronted by the Karunyamrita Tirtham, a lovely tank, and 3 circumambulatory passages, after which you have the final shrine itself. Lord Shiva here is supposed to have lifted his hand and indicated the way to salvation to Shankara. He is supposed to have shown a secret path of escape to a ruler who was being haunted by a ghost. Certainly, he appears to have given a lot of succor and comfort to Gopalakrishna Bharathi. Bharati arrived at Thiruvidai Marudur when it was a kind of a shadow court for the Maratha kingdom. Sharfoji was then the nominal ruler of the kingdom and he was headquartered in Tanjavur. But in Thiruvidai Marudur, the family of the exiled ruler Amarasimha was then living, and they had built a magnificent palace for themselves at the intersection of what was known as Bazar Street and Mahadana Street, facing the temple itself. Amarasimha, the exiled ruler and uncle of Sharfoji, had passed away by that time, and his son Pratapasimha was then living there as a pensioner. And both Amarasimha and Pratapasimha were great patrons of musicians, and several Carnatic and Hindustani musicians took refuge in this court and lived under the patronage of these rulers or these pensioners. There was great rivalry between the Tanjavur court and the Tiruvaimarooth court, and it was accepted that musicians who had taken shelter in one were not welcome in the other. Two great stalwarts at that time were living in the retinue of Pratap Simha, and one of them was Ghanam Krishnaiyer, who saw Bharati, realized his musical talent, and took him under his wings. If Ghanam Krishnaiyer represented the Carnatic tradition, there was a great Hindustani musician known as Ramdas Swami, who was also living in Tiruvaimarooth at that time, and Bharati went to him for seeking the secrets of Hindustani music. So in that 19th century, he appears to have been quite unique in the sense that he learnt both the Hindustani system and the Carnatic system from great practitioners of their time. It is not proper that we should proceed with the Bharati story without dwelling a little bit on Ghanam Krishnaiyer, the prefix Ghanam being given to him because he specialized in a form of Thanam, close-mouthed Thanam that was known as Ghanam, and he was a composer in his own right. Let us listen to one song of his or a part of a song of his before we proceed.
யார் போய் சொல்லுவார் எனக்கான பேரையும் காணும் 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 அன்னமே நான் என்ன செய்வேன் யார் போய் சொல்லுவார் எனக்கான பேரையும் காணும் அன்னமே நான் என்ன
Bharati just did not learn music from these two people. According to his biographer Uve Swaminatha Iyer, Bharati also became a repository of several rare compositions of a lady composer called Mayura Tammal, about whom we know nothing. We don't even know what her compositions were. He also became something of an expert in the Nindastuti compositions of Papa Vinasa Mudaliyar. Nindastuti is a style of composing where, while ostensibly insulting the deity, the composer ends up praising the personage. So Papa Vinasa Mudaliyar was specialized in that genre, and Gopalakrishna Bharathi learned several of his compositions. We know just a handful of those even today. Now, he also was greatly encouraged by a Vaishnavite scholar of the same place, Ananta Bharati, and between Ghanam Krishnaiyer, Ramdas Swami and Ananta Bharati, Bharati or Gopalakrishna Bharathi finally found his feet as a musician and as a scholar. But recognition was going to be quite some long time before it came. In the intermediate stage, he began visiting Chidambaram very regularly from Tiruvaimarooth. Chidambaram in the Shaivite tradition is known as Kovil. Just as in the Vaishnavite tradition, if you say Kovil, you mean Srirangam. In the Shaivite tradition, the term Kovil or temple means only Chidambaram, nothing beyond that. No other shrine can lay claim to that title. Muthuswami Dikshitar in his Ananda Natana Prakasham says, Shri Kedaradi Kshetradharam. He says, this is the temple that forms the foundation of all the great Shaivite shrines all over the country, beginning with Kedara. Appar, in his Tirupukku Tandagam, says that every night, all the deities of all the Shiva temples across the world come and take shelter in Chidambaram, then they go back to wherever they belong next day in the morning. Bharati, when he arrived at Chidambaram, experienced a great awakening. He saw the Kanaka Sabha, he saw the dancing Lord, he saw the shrine of Govindaraja, the temple to goddess Shivakami. He saw all of it and he was like someone transformed. Thereafter, Chidambaram would become the shrine that he would be associated with for all time to come. It exerted a certain pull on him the way it had done with composers from time immemorial. Certainly, if you look at the Nayanmars, all of them adored Chidambaram in one way or the other. The big three, the Thevaram hymnodists, Appar, Samandar and Sundarar, and then outside of the Nayanmars, Manika Vachakar lavished several compositions on the principal deity over here. In the Carnatic tradition too, several composers gave a huge corpus of songs to this temple. And in the Tamil composing, in the tradition of composing Carnatic kritis in Tamil, this temple was certainly the forerunner. But let us have one song of Gopalakrishna Bharathi on this temple. Then let us see what the temple did for Bharati.
கருணை கடலென்று உன்னை 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 காதில் கேட்டு நம்பி வந்தேன் கருணை கடலென்று உன்னை காதில் கேட்டு நம்பி வந்தேன் இரக்கம் வராமல் போனதென்ன காரணம் என் சுவாமிக்கு இரக்கம் வராமல் போனதென்ன காரணம் என் சுவாமிக்கு இரக்கம் வராமல் போனதென்ன காரணம் என் சுவாமிக்கு.
As I said earlier, this temple played a very important role when it came to composing songs in Tamil in the Carnatic tradition. The pioneer in that was Muthu Tandavar. It is said that Muthu Tandavar suffered the privations of poverty, was abandoned in the temple of Sirgari, starved, and one night went into a faint because of malnutrition, woke up in the middle of the night to find that the temple doors had been locked and that he was trapped inside the shrine, wept, and then the goddess came in the guise of the priest's daughter, gave him food, and then instructed him to go to Chidambaram. And that is when he migrates to that temple town. When he comes there, he is asked by the Lord to begin composing on him. Muthu Tandavar has never composed before. And he says, where am I going to go and find the words to compose? The Lord tells him, all you have to do is to go to the sanctum and wait. take the first words that you hear every day and start composing using them. So Muthu Tandavar goes to the temple, and the first thing he hears is Bhuloka Kailayagiri Chidambaram Allal. That is the first expression that a devotee is uttering at that point of time. He takes that and he begins to create compositions. Thereafter, he leaves behind a beautiful set of songs dedicated to Chidambaram. There are compositions that describe the plan of the temple. There are compositions that describe temple festivals. There are songs that are just ecstatic about having had the darshanam of the Lord. We will find that Gopalakrishna Bharathi follows the tradition of Muthu Tandavar almost completely. Similar to him, there are compositions where he is just delighted at having seen Nataraja. There are compositions where he is describing the plan of the temple. If you remember, in Muthu Tandavar's composition, Kanamal Veenile Kalam Kazhithome, the song says that we have wasted our time without going and visiting Chidambaram. And what does he do in all the charanams? He describes the Panchakshara Padi, the 5 steps going up to the sanctum. It describes the way Nataraja is dancing. It describes the temple of Sivakami, the bells ringing in the evening. Even today, when you go in the evening to Chidambaram and the Deeparadhana is going on, it's a magical sight. There's not just one bell ringing, there are a series of bells ringing all around the temple. When I went, there was an old lady ringing a small set of bells connected to each other by means of a thin rope that she was holding on, and that was just adding to the music. The bells together create a certain orchestra and a divine feeling. All that is included in that composition. In the same style, we have Gopalakrishna Bharathi's Enne Ramum, where he again describes the sanctum and the plan and the layout of the temple. We also have songs like Natanamadinar, where he says he came in the month of Thai during the festival and he witnessed Nataraja dancing. Let us listen to that song now.
Natanam Adinar Vegnagari Gamagave Kanaka Sabailananda Natanam Adinar Vegnagari Gamagave Kanaka Sabail Ananda Natanam Adinar வடகையிலையில் முன்னாள் மாமுனி கருள் செய்தபடி தவறாமல் தில்லைப்பதியில் வந்து தை மாசத்தில் குரு பூசத்தில் பகல் நேரத்தில் வடகையிலையில் முன்னாள் மாமுனி கருள் செய்தபடி தவறாமல் தில்லைப்பதியில் வந்து தை மாசத்தில் குரு பூசத்தில் பகல் நேரத்தில் தாம் தகிட்ட தகஜம் தகணம் தரி கும் தரி தீம் திமித தகண்டம் தணனம் தரிணம் தரி ததினுதினு ததி தாம் தி தோம் தீம் தாகத தஜ்ஜணு ஜனம் தடிங் டிங்கு ததைய தைய ததிமித கிட தக தகத ஜொணு ததிமித கிட தகதாம் திக்கிடதகதை ததோம் என்று நடனம் ஆடினார் வெகுநாகரிகமாக வெகனக சபையில் நடனம் ஆடினார்.
Along with his musical development, Bharathi appears to have focused on spirituality as well. His guru in this was a personage known as Govinda Shivam. We have no idea who he was. All we know is that he was a saintly personality who lived in the Mayuram area, Mylapore area. Bharathi has dedicated one composition to him. Let us see what he has to say. Engal Gurunatharudaya Inayadi Toluvai Maname. Pray to the feet of my Guru. Tingal Udayam Pole Govinda Sivam Endre in the Bhumiyil Vanda. Like the rising of the full moon, this Govinda Sivam has come to this earth. Harihara Bedam Kadandu, Akanda Sachidanandamai Paravi Nindre, Abhinnamai Paradar Endre, Shruti Yukti Anubhavatal Solli Solli Palavidamai, Virindu Nindra Vishaya Vriddhi Ver Aruttandu Konda, Engal Gurunatharudaya Inayadi Toluvai Maname. Having crossed the differences of Hari and Hara, that is, there is no difference between Vishnu and Shiva, and manifesting himself as that supreme bliss and helping me to cut asunder all bondage, this Govinda Sivam has come to this world. That is Bharati on his Guru. He becomes a practicing yogin, meditates for long hours in the Chidambaram temple, and also begins slowly wherever he goes, he begins spending several hours in meditation and in reflection and elevating his spiritual self. Eventually, Bharati slowly begins expressing himself in public. As Shankara says in his Dakshinamurti Stavam, Nana Chidra Ghatopamastita, like the light, Deepa Prabha Bhaswaram, like a light which is inside a pot with numerous holes all around it. Just as that light begins to come out, slowly Bharati's brilliance begins to manifest itself. People begin to listen to his singing, and then there is a request that he should begin discoursing. He should begin talking about spiritual matters. He should begin combining music and spirituality. And he, in effect, slowly becomes what we recognize today as a Katha Kalakshepam or a Harikatha exponent. He was perhaps one of the earliest to do so. He certainly had all that was required. He had a great vocabulary, he could sing, and he was completely immersed in spirituality. And finally, he was able to express himself in the language of the common man. People who sat in front of him were able to understand exactly what he was trying to say. People began to flock to listen to Bharati. Bharati himself was not to be confined to any one place. He kept moving around that belt of Mylapore, Tanjavur, Thiruvidai Marudur, and once decides to go to Thiruvayaru to meet Tyagaraja. By the time, Tyagaraja is a great celebrity. Let us not forget that in his composition Dasarathi, he says, Asadira Dura Desamuna Prakashamujesina Rasika Shiromani. O Rama, you have made me famous in far off lands to my satisfaction. And certainly by that time, disciples of Tyagaraja were all over South India. They were singing his compositions. He was a very well-known personality. This must have been sometime in the 1830s or in the 1840s, towards the end of Tyagaraja's life. And very interestingly, just the time when Bharati's fame is slowly on the ascendant. Bharati visits Tyagaraja. Swaminatha Iyer leaves behind a description of that incident and says that Bharati told him this story, and therefore there is no reason for us to doubt the veracity of what happened. Tyagaraja was teaching his disciples, and there was a composition, Sriramya Chitta Alankara Swarupa, that was being rendered. Bharati, having arrived, Tyagaraja did not recognize him, but made him welcome, and then asked him as to where he had come from. Bharati said that he came from Mudikondan, because that was the village where he was staying at that time. In fact, for a very long period of time, Bharati was known as Mudikondan Gopalakrishna Bharathi. That was the village where he was living then. And Tyagaraja is supposed to have asked him, have you heard of a Gopalakrishna Bharathi from the same place? And then Bharati, with great humility, introduced himself as that person. Tyagaraja was very pleased, and then he asked him whether he had ever composed a song in the raga in which Sriramya Chitta Alankara Swarupa was being rendered. Bharati said no, but then went back and thought about it that evening and came back with a composition and sang it the next day in the morning. And that was Sabhapati ki Veridevam Samanamahuma, Tillai Sabhapati ki Veridevam Samanamahuma. Tyagaraja was delighted. There is just one loose end in this story. Sriram Chitta Alankara Swarupa is in Jayamanohari, while Sabhapati ki Veridevam is in Abhogi. The difference between the two ragas is only the Nishada, nothing beyond that. Are we therefore to interpret that Sriram Chitta Alankara Swarupa was originally in Abhogi and migrated to Jayamanohari? Or are we to interpret that Sabhapati ki Veridevam was originally composed in Jayamanohari and later migrated to Abhogi? I leave you with that thought, but I do not think it would be appropriate to move ahead without a little bit of that evergreen song, Sabhapati ki Veridevam.
Kripanidhi, Kripanidhi, ivare pole Kripanidhi, ivare pole Kripanidhi, ivare pole Kripanidhi, ivare pole கிடைக்குமோ இந்த தரணி தன்னில் சபாபதிக்கு வேறு தெய்வம் சமானமாகுமா? கிருபாநிதி இவரை போல கிடைக்குமோ இந்த தாரணி தன்னில் சபாபதிக்கு வேறு தெய்வம் சமானமாகுமாதில்லை. சபாபதிக்கு வேறு தெய்வம் சமானமாகுமா?
Bharati, as I said, lived in Mudikondan for a number of years and came to be known as Mudikondan Bharati. Now, this is a village that is one of a set of 18, which is inhabited largely by a subsect among Brahmins known as the Madhyama community. These have done phenomenal service to the field of music by way of patronage and also by way of being exponents of the art. In modern parlance, you think of the names Tirukodi Krishna Iyer, Shemangudi Srinivasa Iyer, Shemangudi Narayan Swami Iyer, Koneri Rajapuram Vaidyanath Iyer, P.S. Narayana Swami, all of these, Mudikondan Venkatrama Iyer, all of these people come from this community that inhabited 18 of those villages. One of the most prominent settlements in this group is Ananda Tandavapuram, known also as Anatandapuram and also as Anandam. A very fertile locality surrounded by green fields. And this is where there was a very prosperous landlord by name of Annu Iyer. Bharati arrives at Annu Iyer's residence one day when the Ramanavami is being celebrated. There is a Ramayana discourse going on inside, and it has come to the point where Hanuman has met Sita, has been introduced to Ravana, has defied Ravana, and then has set fire to Lanka. The Rakshasis come rushing to Sita and tell her, you remember that red-faced monkey that came and was in conversation with you? Well, let us tell you that its end is very much in sight. Its tail has been set fire to. Whereupon Sita prays to Agni Bhagavan and says that if I am a chaste woman, then you should not consume Anjaneya, control your appetite and may your hunger be fulfilled. Bharati, it is said, on hearing this line said, I wish somebody would fulfill my hunger. And Annu Iyer, having heard that, went out, saw Bharati and invited him in and then asked him what he could do for him. Bharati then sang a few songs of his. Annu Iyer was very impressed and told him that hereafter, you should stay with me, you should live in my house, and I will take care of all your wants, you don't have to go anywhere. Thereafter begins a very comfortable period and a very creative phase in Bharati's existence, living as he is in the patronage of Annuvayar. He observes his patron very closely, he goes around the village very closely, he sees the various parts of the area, he studies everything with a creative mind. In the meantime, his discoursing is going on, he is telling stories, he is composing, he is singing them in public, he is very much in demand at various places. He goes to Nagapattinam, and there he meets Kandappa Chettiar, a very wealthy businessman. The Chettiars have always been in the forefront of patronage when it comes to Katha Kalakshepam and Harikatha. And Kandappa Chettiar tells Bharati that so far you have been composing several compositions. Incidentally, I must tell you here that these independent compositions of Bharati bear his mudra of Gopalakrishnan or Balakrishnan, etc. And these are known as Vidudi Kirtanekal. They are independent of the Nandan Charitram. Kandappa Chettiar is the man who asks him, why don't you compose an opera or an entire Kalakshepam on the life of one of the Nayanmars, because that is what we would all like to hear from you. Bharati begins contemplating the idea. Swaminatha Iyer writes that when Bharati was impressed with a particular idea, he always looked for a particular word which would spur his creativity. And Swaminatha Iyer gives this example of how once Swaminatha Iyer used the word Kanaitan, which basically means laugh in a derisive fashion. And Bharati immediately worked on it and said, Kanaitan, Yaru Kanaita, Yaman Kanaitan, Yadarkaga Kanaitan. Now the story is, he laughed derisively. Who laughed derisively? Yama, the god of death, laughed derisively. Why did he laugh in that fashion? Because Parikshit thought that he could escape death by building an ivory tower, sitting in it and listening to the Bhagavatam, and thereafter Bharati launched into an exposition of that story. Similarly, next day in the morning after this conversation with Kandappa Chettiar, a plate full of fruits arrived for Bharati from the Chettiar. And Pazhang Narungamanum was the first expression that he took, and he began composing the Nandan Charitram thereafter. Why Nandan Charitram? Bharati, as I had told you earlier, would often go to the Chidambaram shrine, and while there he would meditate in front of the Nritta Sabha, by the side of which there is a small sanctum to Nandanar, the great devotee of Lord Shiva. In the Periya Puranam of Chekilar, which is the first comprehensive narrative of the lives of the 63 saints who are known as the Aravati Mover, Nandan Charitram is just one page. He is given the name Thirunalai Povar, and the story is sketchy to the extreme. Nandanar was working in a village, he was a farm hand. He had this great desire to go and see Chidambaram. He goes in between to Tirupungur. The Nandi blocks his vision of the Lord. He prays to the Lord, the Nandi moves away. He is able to have a vision of the Lord. Then he realizes that he must dig a well or a tank in this village of Tirupungur. Lord Shiva realizes that it is not within his capability to do so and sends his attendants, the Bhutaganas, to help him to finish that task. Nandan has this great desire to go to Chidambaram or Tillai, but because he is unable to do so, keeps postponing it day after day after day, saying, I'll go tomorrow, I'll go tomorrow, I'll go tomorrow. Eventually, people begin to refer to him as Thirunalai Povar. He will go tomorrow. Finally, Nandan does go to Chidambaram, and there he merges in a blaze of light into the Lord. This is all that there is in the Periya Purana. Under Bharati, however, this was not something that was going to remain that small or that inchoate a story. He decided that he had to make it into a full-length opera, complete with drama, multiple characters, emotions, music, dialogue, you name it, and he had it for you. Now, where was Bharati's inspiration coming from? This was a time when several great dramatic works were making their presence felt in that entire Tanjavur region. In the Tamil tradition, apart from the great epics such as the Silappatikaram and all that, you had what was known as the Pallu Natakam. The Pallu Natakam has got Pallan and Palli, that is the cultivator and his wife. And there is a Pannayar. The Pannayar is the landlord. So the Pallan and the Palli have an argument with each other. They finally go to the Pannayar, who administers justice and makes peace between the two of them. So remember, there is a landlord or a Pannayar coming in. You had the Bhagavata Mela tradition in nearby Mylapore, where Prahlada Charitram would be enacted once a year, complete with full theatrical effects. Tyagaraja was so enamored by that he had created Prahlada Bhakti Vijayamu. He had also done the opera Nauka Charitramu, which by itself had a history, with several others having created Nauka Charitrams before Tyagaraja created it. So there were Tamil plays, there were Telugu plays, and above all, there were Marathi plays. The Marathi Natya Sangeet tradition had spread all around Tanjavur because the area was being ruled by Maratha kings at that point of time. And artists from Maharashtra were coming down and they were narrating the stories of the Bhakti saints, they were enacting it. Various new forms of music were entering Carnatic traditions. The Tala structures had changed. Chaputhalams had come in. The use of the castanet or the chipla. All of this had been brought in by the Marathi tradition. Bharathi was therefore the right man at the right place at the right moment. And then he begins work on his Nandanar Charitram. Nandanar Charitram is not just the story of Nandan. In order to show the contrast, there is the Vedyar. The Vedyar does not exist in Chekizhar's Periya Puranam. It is entirely Bharati's contribution to Nandanar Charitram. He creates a landlord. The landlord is the contrast to Nandan. Nandan becomes a bonded laborer in the field of the landlord and is unable to go to Chidambaram. And much of the play is Nandan overcoming the resistance of his own community people and the resistance of the landlord, finally overcoming the resistance of the orthodox Dikshitas of the temple and being let in. Of course, all of it with divine intervention. It is very interesting that there is no romantic interest in this entire story. And yet, Bharati, such is the tightness of Bharati's narrative, such is the musicality that he brings in, that it is a gripping drama even today after so many years of its creation. Bharati brings in the story, the Tirupungur episode, beautifully in the Nandan Charitra. So Nandan goes to Tirupungur along with all his friends from his community of farmhands, and there, his caste being such and such being the orthodoxy of the times, he is unable to enter the temple and he looks from outside. And then he is unable to see the Lord because the Nandi is standing in the way, and then he prays to the Lord that the Nandi should be asked to move. Let us listen to the song.
வழிமறை தீர்க்குதே மலை போலே ஒரு மாடு படுத்திருக்குது வழிமறை தீர்க்குது மலை போலே ஒரு மாடு படுத்திருக்குது வழிமறை தீர்க்குது மலை போலே ஒரு மாடு படுத்திருக்குது பாவி நந்தன் இந்த ஊரில் வந்தும் பாவி நந்தன் இந்த ஊரில் வந்தும் பவி நந்தன் இந்த ஊரில் வந்தும் இவன் பாவம் தீரேனோ பாதத்தில் சேரேனோ ஏரேனோ சிவலோகநாத பாவம் தீரேனோ பாதத்தில் சேரேனோ ஏரேனோ சிவலோகநாத வழிமறை தீர்க்குது மலை போலே ஒரு மாடு படுத்திருக்குது.
The temple at Tiruppungur is a very ancient one. Definitely it has existed from the time of the Cholas, and the story of Nandan in Sekirar's Periya Puranam was after all written during the time of Kulottunga Chola. So the temple's architecture itself follows this narrative, and the original Chola Nandi, which is very small, is to one side of the sanctum, not in front of the Lord. The Nayaks, who then came in the 16th century, they executed an enormous stone Nandi, also on one side of the sanctum, thereby not blocking the view of the Lord. The Kodikambam or the Dvajastambam of the temple is also in alignment with the Nandi, so that anybody who stands at the entrance can get a clear view of the sanctum. Bharathi must have definitely come and visited Tiruppungur, because Malai pole oru maadu padithirukkude, that Nandi is really like a hill. It is so big. Now let us see what Lord Shiva says to the Nandi to get him to move, as per Bharati's Nandan Charitra.
பக்தியில் கரை கண்டவன் பக்தியில் கரை கண்டவன் பார்த்து பார்த்து உண்டவன் பக்தியில் கரை கண்டவன் பார்த்து பார்த்து உண்டவன் சித்தம் குறையில் நமது செல்வம் மூற்றும் குறையும் தயவு செய்து நீ சற்றே விலகீரும் பிள்ளாய் சித்தம் குறையில் நமது செல்வம் மூற்றும் குறையும் தயவு செய்து நீ சற்றே விலகீரும் பிள்ளாய் சந்நிதானம் மறைக்குதா நீ சற்றே விலகீரும் பிள்ளாய்
The Nandi therefore moves on listening to this entreaty from Lord Shiva. Now, the Nandan Charitram is not just a collection of kritis like this. What makes it of great dramatic interest is the variety of composition that is brought into it. There are dialogues, and then there are various kinds of compositions inspired by forms in Tamil, forms in Marathi, and so you have meters such as Saki, Dindi, Ovi, then you've got Chindu, Nondi Chindu, and then you have got something called the Khadga, Periya Khadga, Chinna Khadga, you've got Esal, you've got Dvipada. There are several forms, and that is what creates a lot of interest in the Nandan Charitram. Just to give you an example, Nandan sees the Nandi moving, and he is overcome with delight at the fact that he is able to see the Lord. A standard Carnatic composition here would have failed. Let us see what Bharati creates in order to bring that drama into the story.
குதித்தார் எக்களித்தார் உள்ளம் கழித்தார், பள்ளு படித்தார், கண்ணீர் வடித்தார், பற்களை கடித்தார், ஒரு தரம் துடித்தார், இருதரம் நடித்தார், தரிசனம் செய்தாரே நந்தனார் தரிசனம் செய்தாரே, இப்படி தரிசனம் செய்தாரே நந்தனார் தரிசனம் செய்தாரே. குதித்தார், எக்களித்தார், உள்ளம் கழித்தார், பள்ளு படித்தார், கண்ணீர் வடித்தார், பற்களை கடித்தார், ஒரு தரம் துடித்தார், இருதரம் நடித்தார், தரிசனம் செய்தாரே நந்தனார் தரிசனம் செய்தாரே, இப்படி தரிசனம் செய்தாரே நந்தனார் தரிசனம் செய்தாரே.
This is truly an opera in the sense that everybody sings. Even the villagers sing, the landlord sings, the lord sings, the priest sing, everybody sings in the play. It's one continuous musicality right through. And so, having had darshanam at Tirupungur, now Nandan wants to go to Chidambaram. The villagers of his community, they are completely disturbed. Bharathi then demonstrates that. They are now coming to the Vediyar or the landlord and they complain to him and tell him that there is something very strange going on over here which we are unable to understand. You will have to intervene, and let us see how they complain to the landlord.
சேதி சொல்ல வந்தோம் நந்தனார், சேதி சொல்ல வந்தோம், சேதி சொல்ல வந்தோம் நந்தனார், சேதி சொல்ல வந்தோம் நந்தனார், சேதி சொல்ல வந்தோம் நந்தனார், சேதி சொல்ல வந்தோம். சாதி முறைமை தெரியாதவன், நமக்குதவாதவன் என்றொரு மாதமாய் தெரிந்த சேதி சொல்ல வந்தோம் நந்தனார், சேதி சொல்ல வந்தோம் நந்தனார், சேதி சொல்ல வந்தோம் நந்தனார், சேதி சொல்ல வந்தோம்.
The tune has changed over time, but the impact of the lyric, the respectful way in which they are coming and saying, Sedi solla vandom, we have come to tell you something has happened to Nandan, so please come and intervene. Thereafter begins a continuous conversation, almost like a duet, between the landlord and Nandan, each arguing for his own sake. You can see at the end that there is a lot of affection that each has for the other. But Nandan's love for Chidambaram is overriding everything else. The landlord finally lays a condition that all these acres of land will have to be planted. Lord Shiva intervenes and ensures that everything is planted. The landlord realizes that he was in error. But the conversations between Nandan and the landlord make for fascinating hearing. And perhaps one of the best renditions we have had is of Dandapani Desigar and Serigalathur Shama in Gemini's production Nandanar Charitram or Bhakta Nandanar, which came out in the 1940s. And I'm going to play a clipping of that for you to show you how that drama unfolds in the film. Perhaps the greatest monument to Nandan Charitram is in a small mandapam that was created in the 1960s in Tirupungur itself, because in the song Vazhimarai Thirukkude, Nandanar says, Theradil, from the point where the temple car is, I want to have your darshanam. So it was at that spot that the villagers created a pavilion and a temple for Nandanar. And if you look up at the gopuram of the small pavilion that they have constructed, you will find that there are statuettes of Nandan in conversation with the landlord. There is also a statuette of what the people have imagined Gopalakrishna Bharathi to be, seated and strumming a tambura. Bharathi therefore finally completes his Nandan Charitram, complete with Nandan finally reaching the temple. In the 21st century today, we have several questions about Nandan Charitram, about its final conclusion, about the way Nandan is treated both in the Periya Puranam as well as in Bharatiyar's, Gopalakrishna Bharati's Nandan Charitram. But let us not get into all of that today because that is not relevant to the story of Gopalakrishna Bharati. Bharati, having concluded his Nandan Charitram, finally stages a premiere of it sometime in 1859 or so in Nagapattinam. He narrates it himself, complete with all the songs and the dialogue, and it goes on for the better part of that night. The people listen to him with rapt attention, and then word gets around. Next night, Bharati is invited to perform it again. He performs it again and again and again, and there appears to be no end to the crowds that are coming to watch him enact the Nandan Charitram. In Karaikal, in neighboring Karaikal, which is French territory, officers don't land up for work. The agriculturists don't come to work on the farms in the morning. Everybody is in one sleepy haze. The collector, a Frenchman, Cisse, wants to know what is happening, and he institutes enquiries. And then finds out, the people tell him that, don't you know, that there is a great man called Gopalakrishna Bharathi who is telling a story night after night in nearby Nagapattinam, and we are all going there to listen to the story, which is why we are not able to get up in the morning and report to work. Cisse is intrigued and he says, I also would like to listen to that story. So they invite Bharati to Karaikal, and there in front of an invited audience, Bharati once again performs his Nandan Charitram. Cisse is so impressed by this mono act that he says that this has to be published and the work has to reach a larger public. In 1861, with funding by Cisse, the Nandan Charitram is brought out as a book in 1861. Since then, it has remained in print till date. You can imagine what kind of a success it was when it was first published. Swaminath Iyer, with what I feel was a touch of envy, even says that the very next year, a second edition of the book was published. And certainly, being an author, he knew what it was to have a second edition of a book published within 1 year in that 19th century. You just have to look at the life of A.M. Chinnasamy Mudaliar, who created Oriental music in European notation. People wanted free copies. 2 copy free கொடுத்துட்டு போங்க, அதை படிச்சுட்டு நாங்கள் நன்னா இருந்ததுன்னா அப்புறம் வாங்கிக்கிறோம். And after that, neither did they read the free copies, nor did they return it to him. They never bought extra copies from him. So if you were an author then, and probably now, you were left with a lot of copies of the books that you published, and the only value was for free copies that you had to give. But here it was, Bharati's Nandan Charitram was being sold, people were singing it, people were discussing it. It became one of the great successes of the 19th century. Certainly, its fame spread far and wide, and when its fame spread far and wide, naturally there were detractors as well. So at that point of time, there was a composer who had created a story of Appar or Thirunavukarasar as an opera. He lived in Kurainadu in near Mayavaram, and nobody was paying any attention to his opera. Naturally, he became jealous, and according to Swaminath Iyer, he created a composition which his disciples then sang. Nandan Charitirathai Kelade, Naalum Vanda Daridrandan Malade. Do not listen to the story of Nandan. You will suffer poverty for the rest of your life. Tan Tanamaka Kulvan Dadi Brahmachari. Tayyalar Mel Perum Kama Vikari. This Gopalakrishna Bharathi, who is pretending to be a brahmachari, he is actually a womanizer of the first water. So do not ever go near him. So this was the kind of composition that was being taught so that his detractors could sing it. Bharati had a few disciples. So there was Ramaswamy Iyer of Mayavaram and his younger brothers Natesh Iyer and Subramanya Iyer. Then there was Sivashankara Dikshitar, Rajaratna Dikshitar. These were all Dikshitars in the service of the Chidambaram temple. These people were highly incensed, and they decided to create a composition to rival this particular lampooning of Bharati, and that was Appan Charitirathai Sollade, Kapparayum Kayyumaga Nillade. Do not recite the story of Appar and go around with a begging bowl in your hand. So Bharati, when he got to know that his disciples had created a composition like this, was exceedingly upset. and he told them that this is not the thing that you should be doing. Stop it with this. If there are problems with my composition, it's not necessary for everybody to like what I have written. Just let it be. And eventually, merit will triumph. If my work is good, it will work. If it doesn't, so bad, too bad for it, and then, it may not survive the test of time. And so that was it. Bharati was, very peace-loving, and he just did not want any arguments with anybody. But poor Bharati at this time, it was almost as though the proverbial evil eye had fallen upon him, that just around the time when the Nandan Charitram was becoming exceedingly popular, his patron Annu Iyer passed away in Ananda Tandavapuram. Not only did he pass away, he left behind no records of the money that Bharati had invested with him. And his son, Vengu Iyer, refused to give Bharati any money. It took Bharati and his disciples quite some time to collect that money from Vengu Iyer, and having got it, Bharati entrusted the money to his disciple Ramaswamy Iyer of Mayavaram and vanished. Nobody knew where Bharati had gone. And for a good 10 years of his life, we have no idea what Bharati did between 18, maybe 6 years or so of Bharati's life, not 10. But we have no idea where Bharati did, what he was doing. The rumor is that he was with Ramalinga Swamigal at Vadalur. And what lends credence to this rumor is the fact that it was in 1876 that Ramalinga Swamigal dematerialized. And immediately after that, Bharati surfaced once again in Mylapore or Mayavaram. And he surfaced in a very dramatic fashion. It was the October of 1876, and the river Kaveri, the festival of Tula Ghattam, Tula Snanam, was being observed when the river is in spate and people come to have their bath in the river. And early in the morning, the famous performer Mahavaidyanatha Sivan and his powerful brother Ramaswamy Sivan were having their bath in the Kaveri, when they looked up and they found Bharati having a bath next to them. And they were stunned because Bharati had not been seen for quite a few years. And having seen him, it was a great reunion of sorts. And then they told him that, don't you know that your Nandan Charitram is going to be performed this evening in Mylapore by the great Tanjavur Krishna Bhagavatar. Tanjavur Krishna Bhagavatar, who is really considered to be the father of the Harikatha movement or the art form of Harikatha. Bharati was delighted, and that evening in the company of Mahavaidyanatha Sivan and Ramaswamy Sivan, he attended the performance of his Nandan Charitram by Tanjavur Krishna Bhagavatar and greatly praised the way this exponent had made it into a fine art, and he had narrated the story. Bharati thereafter retires to live in Mayavaram, but remember that he was a brahmachari and practically a sannyasi. He therefore had no wants. His only garment was a 4-cubit length dhoti that he wound around his waist, and he had no need for money as well. He lived on the platform, the pile, the seat outside his disciple Ramaswamy Iyer's house in Mayavaram. That is where he was most of the time. He had a very interesting system of banking. Whenever people came to him and they were so moved by what he had done and they wanted to give him money, he would tell them, hang on, you don't have to give it to me, but I'll write down in my notebook that you have promised to give me this much of money. That's all. He would note it down and keep it. Later, if somebody came to him in want of money, or if he got to know that somebody needed money, he would call them and tell them, so-and-so promised to give me this much of money. It is written over here. I'll give you a chit. You go to him and you collect the cash. So, in many ways, he was like a forerunner of M.S. Subbulakshmi. Remember that for much of her life, concert performances would happen. The check for the performance would be made out in the name of some charity or the other, who would come and collect the money and leave. Bharati was much before this, but he really established a great tradition of charity. He need not have done it. He could have lived his life in great comfort and happiness, but he chose to be like this. At this time, Bharati, living in Mylapore, took to the violin and not only became good at it, he began teaching people the violin as well. He would be found at the Tula Ghatta Paditure, that is the ghat where the Tulasnanam happens. He would be seated there performing the violin. Several people came to learn music from him. And who were these people? They were all lawyers in the district court at Mylapore. Why were they coming to him and why were they sending their children to him? There was a district munsif called Mayuram Vedanayakam Pillai, who was a great composer. Sarva Samaya Sara Kirtanaigal are very well known. And they thought that if they learnt his compositions and sang them to him in court, the judgments would go in their favor. But Bharati and Vedanayakam Pillai were exceedingly close friends. And so Bharati, with great love and affection, taught the compositions and taught music to several of them. It is also said that when Vedanayakam Pillai composed songs, he had them checked by Bharati for veracity of the tune and regarding matters of alliteration and things like that. Bharati and Vedanayakam Pillai's great friendship culminated in the only example of Bharati's song where he praises a human being, and that was Vedanayakam Pillai. In the 1880s, there was a great famine in this entire Madras presidency and hundreds were dying. It was known as the Dhatu Varsha Panjam. And Vedanayakam Pillai himself wrote compositions like Panjam Tiraya, Unnai Andri Veraya, songs where he describes the suffering of the people. He spent his own money and established gruel kitchens where people could come and be fed for free. Bharati was so moved that he created a song, Niye Purusha Meru, that is, you are that mythical Meru mountain which gives everything that people want. Sadly, that composition is lost today. We don't have any idea what the rest of the words were like. It is at this time that Bharati meets Uve Swaminatha Iyer. Swaminatha Iyer, a young boy of 17, is brought to Mylapore to learn Tamil from the great Vidwan, Mahavidwan Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai. And Swaminatha Iyer's father was known to Gopalakrishna Bharathi. Swaminatha Iyer himself was greatly enamored of the Nandan Charitram. He says that he began learning it when he was around 5. And he was very keen to learn music from Gopalakrishna Bharathi. Bharati told him that I have no idea what your Guru Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai may say. Even though he is a very close friend of mine, he may not like the idea that you are learning music from me. So, Swaminatha Iyer began learning music on the sly from Gopalakrishna Bharathi. But sure enough, Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai found out one day and then told Swaminatha Iyer that you have to make a choice. You either learn music or you learn Tamil, because when you sing, you tend to distort the Tamil syllables, and that is not acceptable to a purist like me. Swaminatha Iyer sacrificed his musical interest and went to learn Tamil from Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai. But he has a very interesting incident to relate here. He says that it was Gopalakrishna Bharati's dearest wish that Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai writes a verse in praise of his Nandan Charitram. People at that time were saying that while the Nandan Charitram is very nice, it had taken liberties with Tamil. It had introduced Sanskritized words. That was Bharati's way of speaking, his way of composing. So purists were not entirely in favor of it. Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai was certainly a purist. He was not very keen on giving a verse praising the work, and he kept postponing it continuously. At this time, Gopalakrishna Bharathi never gave up. He continued following up with Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai. One afternoon, Bharati arrives at Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai's residence. Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai is taking his afternoon nap. Bharati waits outside the house and, as was his habit, begins singing. Hearing the music, Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai wakes up and then begins to pay attention to the words. He is so moved by hearing what Bharati was singing that he comes out and readily gives him a verse in praise of the Nandan Charitram. Komevu Tirithillai Natarasha Perumandraal Kudi Uinda Pumevu Peranbar Tirunalai Povartham Punida Siirai Pamevu Palavagaya Vishay Patal Inimayura Padi Indan Yemevu Gopala Kiruttina Bharati Ennum Isai Vallone. This was the verse that Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai writes in praise of Gopalakrishna Bharathi. Bharati wrote a few other operas as well. strangely enough, they never met with the kind of approbation that Nandan Charitram was received with. So there is Iyarpagai Nayanar Charitram, there is Nilakantha Nayanar Charitram, there is Karaikal Ammayar Charitram. All of these appear to have been much smaller in size as compared to the Nandan Charitram, and they appear to have been lost over a period of time. We just have a few fragments from each of these operas, which Harikatha exponents use even today in their performances. Bharati was not just restricted to Chidambaram and Nandanar Charitram. He appears to have travelled, and on one of his rare visits, he appears to have gone to Tiruvannamalai. And he goes there during the time of Kartigai Deepam. In a magnificent composition, Kannara Kandene, he describes the chaos and the clutter and the religious fervour of the crowded Tiruvannamalai shrine while the Kartigai Deepam festival is in progress. Let us listen to a small part of the song and then come to the final portions of Gopalakrishna Bharathi Charitra.
Kannale kande, kannale kande, verondrum எண்ணாமலே நின்றேன் கண்ணாலே கண்டே பண்ணாத புண்ணிய பரிபாகமே பண்ணாத புண்ணிய பரிபாகமே திரு அண்ணாமலையானை உண்ணாமூலையுடன் கண்ணாலே கண்டே புந்தி மகிழவே ஹுக்கா குடித்திடும் புகையினால் ஆமோதமும் புறையில்லாத அவ்வந்தனர் கூடி புகழ்ந்திடும் சதுர்வேதமும் பந்தி பந்தியாய் தேவதாசிகள் பாடி வரும் சங்கீதமும் பாரளந்த கோபாலகிருஷ்ணன் பணிந்திடும் திருப்பாதமும் அந்தி வேளையில் மண்டபங்களில் ஆரதி கற்பூரம் புகைந்திட அந்தி வேளையில் மண்டபங்களில் ஆரதி கற்பூரம் புகைந்திட சிந்தை மகிழவே மலைமுகட்டினில் தீப தரிசனம் தாபம் தீரவே அந்தி வேளையில் மண்டபங்களில் ஆரதி கற்பூரம் புகைந்திட சிந்தை மகிழவே மலைமுகட்டினில் தீப தரிசனம் தாபம் தீரவே கண்ணாலே கண்டேன் வேறொன்றும் எண்ணாமலே நின்றே கண்ணாலே கண்டே
Bharati's sense of humor comes across in several of his compositions. In this one, he describes sadhus smoking hookahs, Devadasis coming in great bands and performing there. In other verses in this same song, he describes how the deaf and the dumb come and beg over there, how some of them literally force people to give money to them, how there is a cattle fair that goes on in Tiruvannamalai. Even today it happens during the time of the festival. All of this is described. But he has other compositions as well. For instance, in his Chidambara Kummi, which is practically a guided tour of the Chidambaram temple, there is one verse which talks about the Govindaraja Swami shrine, which is part of the Chidambaram shrine, but is a Vaishnavite Divya Desam. And so he makes fun of the orthodox Vaishnavites who will not look at Nataraja, but will only look at Govindaraja and then come out. So he says, Chidambaram endru sollamale, idai Chithira Kootam endru solli, Nidam Kondadum Ayyangargal vandu nirkirar parungadi. So they will never say Chidambaram, they will only say Tiruchitrakootam. Look at these Iyengars, they have come here to worship. So this is one in his Chidambara Kummi. But even more hilarious is his composition Parthu Kadan Kodungal, which deals with the problems of lending money. He must have seen Annu Iyer giving money to people and then struggling to collect it back. Certainly he was a victim of having invested his money and then not being able to get it back as well. So Parthu Kadan Kodungal is a fantastic composition. It's almost like Polonius' speech to Laertes in Hamlet. And we will listen to a part of it over here.
பார்த்து கடன் கொடுங்கள், மனிதரை பார்த்து கடன் கொடுங்கள், பார்த்து கடன் கொடுங்கள், மனிதரை பார்த்து கடன் கொடுங்கள், பார்த்து கடன் கொடுங்கள். பார்த்து கடன் கொடுக்காவிடில் பணம் போகும், பார்த்து கடன் கொடுக்காவிடில் பணம் போகும், பழுதை போலிருந்து பாம்பு போலாகும். பார்த்து கடன் கொடுக்காவிடில் பணம் போகும், பழுதை போலிருந்து பாம்பு போலாகும். பார்த்து கடன் கொடுங்கள். வாது வழக்குகள் பேச கொண்டாட்டம், வாது வழக்குகள் பேச கொண்டாட்டம், வாரண்ட் வந்தால் காரைக்கால் ஓட்டம். வாது வழக்குகள் பேச கொண்டாட்டம், வாரண்ட் வந்தால் காரைக்கால் ஓட்டம். வாது வழக்குகள் பேச கொண்டாட்டம், வாரண்ட் வந்தால் காரைக்கால் ஓட்டம். பாதகமில்லாமல் குடியிருந்தீட்டம், பாதகமில்லாமல் குடியிருந்தீட்டம். பகல் சேர்த்திருடர்கள் இவர் சிரேஷ்டம். பார்த்து கடன் கொடுங்கள், மனிதரை பார்த்து கடன் கொடுங்கள், பார்த்து கடன் கொடுங்கள்.
So be careful when you give money. It starts off as a small matter and then becomes like a cobra. Other people delight in gossiping about it, and when the warrant comes for not having fulfilled the obligation of the debt, the accused invariably runs off to Karaikal. Karaikal was French territory. British law would not be applicable over there, and so warrant vandal Karaikal votam. So all of this Bharati knew even those small subtle nuances of legalese, and he brings it into his composition. Bharati lived up to a ripe old age. Some people say he lived up to the age of 96, some people say he died at the age of 80. There are certain discrepancies in the story in terms of dates if we assume that he passed away when he was just 80. But Bharati waited long, and eventually he must have prayed, Yeppa Varuvaro, when will Nataraja come, when will he give me salvation? So let us listen to that song also.
பாலகிருஷ்ணன் போற்றி பணிந்திடும் ஈசன், பாலகிருஷ்ணன் போற்றி பணிந்திடும் ஈசன், மேலே காதல் கொண்டேன் வெளிப்பட காணேன். ஈசன் மேலே காதல் கொண்டேன் வெளிப்பட காணேன். எப்போ வருவாரோ எந்தன் கலி தீர, எப்போ வருவாரோ எந்தன் கலி தீர, எப்போ வருவாரோ.
Bharati eventually merges with the Lord But Nandan Charitram lives on, his compositions continue to live on. Even during his lifetime, Nandan Charitram had become a cornerstone in the world of Harikatha. Harikatha exponents took to it, performed it, it entered the world of theatre, it then entered the world of cinema. It remained an evergreen success and it continued to be performed, it continues to be performed even today. As I said in the beginning of this presentation, when we think of Bharati, we think of Nandan Charitram. When we think of Nandan Charitram, we think of Bharati. The two of them became one. Without the Harikatha tradition, we have no idea if Nandan Charitram would have survived. But certainly, his standalone compositions became very important in the field of Carnatic music. So, there was a lot of musical merit as well in whatever he had composed. The lyrics were so simple that people were moved by it. There have been several interpretations to Nandan Charitram. There have been questions that have been asked. People like N.S. Krishnan created modifications of the Nandan Charitram in order to take forward social messages. Ultimately, what has triumphed is the devotion that is inherent in that opera and also in the compositions of Gopalakrishna Bharathi. Certainly, that is what he would have wanted, and therefore, he succeeded in more than ample measure. Thank you very much for having been a part of this story of Gopalakrishna Bharathi.